Hello, wonderful. This is Sarah, and I am here with former military participant turned entrepreneur, a man who has worn many hats. But when we met, I was just fascinated by his idea of planning and decision making based on the fact that there is an enemy, right? When you're in the military, you have to prepare for the enemy. And the decisions you make are so important because people's lives are literally in your hands. So you don't want to get it wrong. And I just loved the conversation when I met him on this. And I know you will love it too. Hello, Doug Katz. How are you?
Good. How are you doing today?
I'm very happy. Tell people, I know you have an extensive background, but tell
Right.
people a little bit about how, being in the military and being an entrepreneur has affected how you plan things and how you make decisions.
Well, so I'm a West Point grad, 1993, and I think that's all officers are great. It's just a different experience, and I think you'll learn a lot about
Congratulations on that, by the way.
it.
Yeah, I think that's quite
It's a
a
long
quite a
time ago.
testament.
I am now what they call an old grad. Like I think back, like I think I just had a 93, so you're talking decades ago. And Army Navy's coming up, so I got to say beat Navy. But it's an engineering school first thing, right? So I think there's a lot of overlap between an engineering thought process and a military thought process. But so I went to West Point, went out in the Army for about 5 years as a lieutenant and then eventually a captain in the artillery. And then I did the corporate thing. I'm now in this the more entrepreneurial world. But what was interesting is, and it kind of touches on what you're talking about, when I got out, the big corporations couldn't grab junior military officers fast enough because of their planning. They're thinking critically about different contingencies, thinking about things that could go wrong. How do you fix things that can go wrong? How do you plan in a way that's unpredictable, right? You bring as much predictability to it. But at the end of the day, there's a saying in the military that no plan meets first contact with or survives first contact with the enemy. So I think as we're talking, that's an interesting component of the military plan, because I think when you're not in the military, you make a plan and you're like, it's going to work great. And it never does. I shouldn't say never, it does sometimes. But even something as small as getting your kids out to a party or something is a disaster. So I think having a deliberate planning process is great. So, but you had asked about like what I do. I've been in a lot of different industries. I was in the technology industry for a while. My joke with all my friends are pick what industry I'm in, short it about 5 years after, and you'll probably make a lot of money. So I was in the tech industry. Then I moved into lending, and I've been in lending about 20 years, mortgage lending. And I do residential. I also own my own broker business that does fix and flip and investment stuff. And then I also mediate for people going through a divorce specific to real estate and help people with that, which is another place that planning really comes into play. When I deal with divorcing clients, there's I hate to say a self-victimization, what I see. And there's not this aspect of, yeah, it sucks. There's things outside that are terrible, but there is a planning process that you can use to stay comfortable and make it through.
So I call that emotional elephants. Like if you know that you need to separate out something legally and financially, okay, say in the divorce process, but then you drop an emotional elephant in front of the practical path that you're on. And then it's like this huge elephant in your way. And that's where in something like a divorce or something that's very emotional, I've seen the same thing with people having to care for older parents, things that are very emotionally attached. It's like we can't see what we're supposed to be doing because
Right.
all we see is that emotion. And if we
Oh,
did that in the military, people would be dead, right? Like
it
that
would.
would be
And
completely
what I would
disastrous.
liken it to is there's something called the fog of battle, right? And it's when you make that first contact with the enemy, or the weather isn't what you expected, or all these different things fall into play. All of that will attribute chaos to what you're trying to bring order to. And I got to say, it's funny when you don't have a military person in your family or you haven't been, there's, jokes, right? People have seen MASH. They've seen all these things that are satirical reflections. And then they see the some things that are great reflections of it. And it's really more the latter, right? Like there's a very deliberate planning process. And in the Army, at least, it's called the 5-paragraph operations order. And you do it for everything. You would do an operations order to go to the range. You would do an operations order to attack the enemy. And it makes you think through all of the smallest things, the things that you think are pedestrian or infinitesimally important, but can be really, really important. And part of that, I know you were kind of wanting to talk a little bit about the whole enemy side. Part of that is planning for contingencies that while in the fog of war, the enemy won't do what you want them to do all the time. Sometimes you get lucky, they won't do what you want them to do. And part of my role when I was in the artillery is the only branch in the Army that's got their own intelligence officers. So I would work with, let's say, the battalion staff and the other staff and say, okay, what is the enemy going to do? What are the possible courses of action? And you come up with these contingencies. So when the fog of battle hits, you're able to say, oh, they were going to go this way. Now they're going this way. And the plan, the way I always kind of looked at it as a plan is just making sure everybody kind of is marching in that same direction. And it works on an individual level too, but everybody's sort of looking at it saying, okay, here's what the objective is. Here's what success would be. Here's all of this. And then you can shift and really manage things really, really well. So one thing that I've always heard people say is, again, the military is rigid. That was another thing I always heard. And like, it's interesting, the rigidity in the planning process allows for being innovative in the execution of the plan. And I think people lose that. They know it, right? Like when people are losing weight or doing whatever, oh, I should plan. I should do things a different way. I should, but they don't make a plan. And as a result, they're kind of winging it. And what you were talking about when people die, that if you wing it in something like that, you do end up with bad outcomes. So that planning process allows you to look and say, okay, all this stuff's kind of covered. Like I know that we're covered for ammunition or fuel or all this other kind of stuff. And I know that we've got an idea of what the enemy will do. We've done everything, it was even down to the degree of planning. And once you get into it, it's not that hard to do, but you would look at like the soil type, where if it rained, are you going to have mud or is it going to be, so you would go through, you'd be looking at the weather and trying to figure all that stuff out. And it was, terrible. You're up at 2 a.m. making a plan, but then you realize, well, this is why we're so successful in when we do that kind of stuff. And I think bringing that methodology and that lens was saying, okay, I'm about to do, and unlike the military, you don't have to do it for the little things in life. I think once people start doing it, the planning process gets different. Although I do have to say, I made fun of my brother. He was going to do a spreadsheet for Thanksgiving. And I'm like, not that.
That's funny.
Like, we're not
too much.
One.
Yeah.
His wife agreed with me on that one. But your planning changes, right? And especially for the big things in life, a move. Like I just sold 2 houses and moved to a new one. Having some sort of plan, thinking through things, and knowing, hey, wow, if this doesn't go right, what do I have to do? If this doesn't go right, and going through all that really, really helps.
Well, what I love though, is that you were talking about marching toward a common goal. Because what I see is people like, oh yeah, no, I'm great with all the details. I'm great with this. They never take the action piece. They just do the worry of it. And I love when you say marching toward a common goal, you were talking about planning without overthinking. Mm-hmm. Because at some point you have to do something. You can't just study soil samples for the next 20 years and then just hope the war's over by the time it's,
Well, and I think it's having that objective, right? So in the military, it would be if you're taking an objective, knowing how is that success, right? Like what is success defined by? Is it killing everybody and all the bad guys there? Is it capturing some of them? Is it just suppressing them? There's all these different definitions, but there was always a very measurable, okay, here's what I'm doing here. And until this is done, we don't go on to that next step. And I think that's really important, right? It's important for any planning. It's like looking and saying, okay, the chaos, the fog of war, the fog of life is going on around me. Why was I doing this in the first place? And if you don't have a measurable objective, why are you doing it, right? In the military, very clear cut. You're risking blood, treasure, life, all this kind of stuff for an objective, and it better be worth it. In life, I think a lot of times people don't, right? They don't really think through, is this objective worth my time, my resources, and everything else? And it's different, but you only got 24 hours in a day. You could be spending it with your family. You could be doing other productive things. But if you're spending all this activity doing something and it's not action toward his goal, then why even doing it? And I think that's really an important part of that process.
And in regards, so let's take it back to the real estate and the divorce side, right? And so sometimes it's like, well, what's your objective? Oh, I want to make them pay for what they did to me, or I want to make this, rather than I want the best, I want $10,000 or $100,000 out of the real estate deal, and one is more rational and practical, but the fog of war, the fog of like, but I can see if our military, their objective was, well, we like fighting and we want to make our enemies pay, versus we want to win, and we want a better country, right?
Yeah, and I think, like, it's, if you were to talk to most military guys, there's no joy in that, right? And I think that when you look at it, the example that you used, the parallel I see in the military is to say, okay, no matter what the cost to me, to my men, right? And as a young lieutenant, you're looking, and I think the Army especially, you become very close to your soldiers. You get to a position, unlike many other services, you eat with them, you sleep with them, you do all that stuff. So if I'm looking and saying, we're going to go take this objective, if they all have to die to do that, but I'm successful, then I've hurt myself. There's a unintended consequence of that. And I think when you're talking about divorce, there's that aspect of it. Like, even if you get close to what you want, at what cost was that done? So I think thinking through that objective and saying, okay, I get it. In my heart, I want to make that person pay. But what's the cost to me? What is the damage that I do, right, by doing that? And sometimes that fight isn't worth fighting. There's other ways of doing it. There's another center of gravity that you could focus on that might better achieve your objectives. But I think taking, and I was lucky enough to never be in actual battle. I have many friends who have, and I think taking the emotion out of it in some ways, you make better decisions. And I think something like divorce is the same way. It's very hard to take the emotion out of it. I would say that in many ways, that's probably the hardest part of the planning process for that. But I think stripping out the emotion, putting it in a sort of different silo and dealing with that on the outside, but then dealing with other stuff that's mission critical, right? That was another term you always heard, is mission critical stuff. What's mission critical to get through that divorce? The other stuff you can deal with later. And I think the outcomes are better that way. And I think everything is you should really be thinking about what are the critical. You can't do everything. There's no way to do everything. And I think that you've got to be realistic in that when you're doing that planning.
I love the idea of mission critical. There was a lady I had, and she was so frustrated with her ex because he had said he was going to pay for half of the basketball goal for her child, and didn't. And she said, "Oh, I'm just so worked up. He said he would do something and he didn't, and he owes me $300. And I said, okay, well, how long have you been upset about this? And she said, a week, and it's been terrible. And I said, I'm not trying to be ugly right now, but aren't you in sales? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, if you had spent all the time and energy this week on focusing on your sales, rather than focusing on getting your ex to pay you $300, how much money would you have made? And she said, probably $7,000. And I said, so now the basketball goal has cost you not $300, but $7,000. Right. And she's, when we get caught up in but it's not fair.
Right.
Correct.
Right. It's getting away from that objective. Absolutely. Yes. And I think even with, it's funny when you said focusing on sales, also in the planning process, knowing your resources. Right. So that was a big part of it, right? Like, nothing's unlimited, no ammunition, no food, no fuel. None of it is, infinite. And I think when you were saying her situation, I'm also thinking to myself, you're in sales. Yes, it might have not been an amicable situation, but using those sales skills also in that other situation, right? Like,
love that. Yes.
Dream is getting to yes and getting somebody who was a hard sale, right? Those are the ones where you're like, yeah. And that side of it saying, okay, if you're doing it like this, why don't you find a way to incent that that other person. Now, I've been lucky enough also never to be divorced. So I don't necessarily have the frame of reference of having been in that emotional issue outside of helping people. And my folks were divorced. I'm familiar, and that was back in the 70s. So you're talking a very different divorce landscape. But I think, again, people stopping and it's like anything else, there's the planning part of what we're talking about. But I think also anytime you strip the emotion out, you're able to also react better and work the plan better, right? Because part of it is you've got this plan, but if you get amped up on adrenaline, and I'm going to say scientifically they know this. I don't know what studies I can reference, but your fine motor skill, like when you're really amped up, everything from your fine motor skills to your rational thinking, all that goes out the window. And if you're amped up at that, like you're never going to get down to really saying, okay, am I still working toward this objective? Am I using my resources effectively? Am I doing all the things that I should be doing to really get the outcome I'm looking for? Or am I sabotaging my own outcome? And, among other things, I also did martial arts until COVID hit. And, part of that was always calming it down, broadening your vision, like being able to respond instead of to react. And then, you're planning less in those situations, but you're able to make the right kind of decisions to be able to, effectively get to those objectives.
Oh, I love it. In so many directions I want to take that statement. What is your process of if you get emotionally involved in something or emotionally engaged in something to zero in, stay in the objective, shut out the other stuff? What's your personal process?
For me, I picked up a lot more of that, actually less in the military and more in martial arts. I had a little bit of a hot temper at a point in my life, and learning to sort of slow things down and breathe and, get rational. Like if you study people who do meditation and things like that, that oxygen flow and getting things in and slowing down the heart rate, like you don't make good when your breath gets short and shallow and things like that. You're just hanging on white knuckled on the handlebars. So for me, a lot of it has been slowing things down, catching my breath and assessing and not allowing the situation to dictate my reaction, but looking at everything as in total focus as you can and responding to things as they come. And I think that, my sensei always talked about the reaction versus response. And while there is a distinction and there is a big difference, right? If reaction is like lizard brain kind of instinct, and responding is looking and saying, what is the right counter action for me to do to stay on track and to keep my objective going, or keep moving toward my objective. And I think there is some of that in anything that you do, right? It could be in the military where you have to sometimes you'll take an operational pause to figure out what the heck is going on and to regroup and do certain things. And, in those cases, you've got people hoping that you're panicking and making the wrong reaction because they're doing things to throw you off. So I think it is just really getting back to what really, in many ways, although there are a lot of smart animals out there, that differentiates us from the animal kingdom is our ability to have this cognition. And if you lose that, you're giving up one of the strengths that we have as a species,
Gosh, yes, I love that. What do you think, as far as do you see a lot of people clear on their objectives, or as you're walking through life now? Because I love the question, what problem are you trying to solve?
Yep.
So someone usually comes to me and they're like, and I'm like, okay, what problem are you trying to solve? What problem are you really trying to solve? That's my questioning for getting the clear objective. But most people, there's not enough discussions about this, which is why you and I are having this discussion.
That's why people need coaches, right?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And I think, it's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day because my daughter is at the Coast Guard Academy right now, and she'll, like, unlike when I was at West Point, she could call. So she calls me a lot. And I have that kind of conversation. And I don't think enough parents take on a coaching role, especially now, right? I think that they take on a role of giving the answer. So, hey, getting to that point. And I think that's because the adults don't know how to do that, right? The adults don't know how to stop and say, anything from, hey, the other day, embarrassingly, I went to an event last night, actually, and none of my pants fit, right? I had the COVID issue. I think I put on dress pants in like 6 months. And I was like, okay, what am I going to do now? Well, immediately my brain went to, all right, I've been snacking like a dog at night, and I've been doing all these things. That all goes away. My objective is to drop 10 pounds within X amount of months, and I've done it before, and I know how to do it. I'm going to go through a planning thing. I'm going to execute. I don't think a lot of people know how to do that. I think that that's something that's kind of been lost. I don't know, societally, like people just kind of, we consume instead of doing things these days. And as a result, when you consume, like when people would do projects on their house, you have to have a plan. When you're doing anything, right? You have to have I just moved to an area where I've got like an acre now, a little over an acre, and a lot of trees. And I learned that trees drop a lot of leaves this year. So I went out, but I'm like, okay, now I got to figure out, what am I doing? Like, this is my first year doing it, right? So I'm coming up with a plan with that. Like, what's my objective? Which quickly became, get them all in one area and hire somebody else, which is totally fine. But thinking through that and saying, okay, why am I spending an hour doing this? If it's not worth spending an hour doing it, either I don't know the objective, or the objective isn't worth it and I should be doing something else.
Well, I love emotional intelligence. I love the conversations around emotions. I love all that stuff, but there is a balance to it. And what I see is people trying to label how they feel rather than label their objective, which we need both. I'm not saying don't label how you feel. I'm saying if the only thing that counts is your feelings, and then you lose the objective, you end up on this spin cycle. Is that kind of what you're seeing from people?
Yeah, a little bit. And, I think that I think when you come up with the objective, you also need the why. Like, why is that your objective? I recorded my own podcast yesterday, and we were talking about disaster preparedness. And part of it is the why. Like, you will not commit to the objective unless you, like, why is that the objective, right? Like, why am I picking 10 pounds instead of 15 or 20 or 5? And I don't think enough people understand the why. And that's, again, I think where coaching and things come in well. They're so essential because there's someone else there to say, okay, hear what you're saying, but why is that important to you? And I think once you get the what on the objective and the why you're doing it, it's a heck of a lot easier to plan because you're committed to that objective. I think if you're not committed to the objective, or you're given the objective by someone else, unless it's in a work environment, right? There's times when somebody gives you an objective, but that leader should be able to tell you the why, right? That's the other part. In the world outside of work, you're on your own. So you got to figure out why it's important. And I think that's where a lot of people fail. That's where a lot of people fail on things like, again, losing weight, getting in shape, doing anything is they're never committed to the why. The why is because, I read an article that said I should do this. And they don't look and say, okay, I'm planning for a reason. The why, like when we're talking about divorce, the why you might make certain decisions as you're making that divorce plan might be because, you do want to be financially secure and stuff, but again, you don't want to damage the kid's view of you or the other parent. You don't want to burn up assets, right? I was having lunch with a divorce attorney the other day, and we were talking about like just the cost of divorce, right? And how the face of that is changing, but it could be saying, okay, I'm going to compartmentalize my emotion, keep my objectives clear, commit to these objectives, because that could be a swing of $50,000, which is a year tuition for a kid. I think knowing all those things is important. Kind of going full circle to the military side, when you would get all the planning done, right? It was sort of a hierarchical planning structure, right? So you would get the general plan from, let's say, battalion level, and each company or battery or troop or whatever would go and do their planning and then come back together, and people would brief the plan. But you knew the why, right? Like if there was an objective, because I was artillery, right? So I wasn't like an infantry guy. I would lob big rounds on an objective. And it could say, we need you to suppress them for 30 minutes so that these other guys can go into another area. Well, that's the objective. And I know the why. I'm doing that so that someone else can do their job. And I think that's so essential, because you got to be committed. Like, anytime people fail, it's because they're not committed to that outcome, or they don't fully understand that outcome. And as a result, anything that they're doing, they may get lucky, but generally it's not going to have the outcome they expect because they're wasting a lot of time.
We've talked a lot about planning, but how do you know when it's time to stop planning and start executing?
In the military, it was easy, right? In the military, there was another saying that like an 80% solution on time is better than 100% solution late. And in that world, it was great because there was a set time limit. You had no choice but to, if what's called the line of departure, you basically line up and let's say you're doing an attack, or even worse, let's say you're the defense and the enemy's coming. You don't pick that time. You sort of know when you have to be ready by, and that time is that time. And that's defined by a higher level strategic planning process. I think on an individual level for people, there is very much an aspect of having to say, I'm going to set my own time. Doesn't mean you have to live by it, but it's at least setting something that keeps you honest, right? So as I've gotten, I'll use the example of like, I've gotten into meditation a lot as of late, right? And, well, do I meditate for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15? Like, what am I picking? And, I think that there's that sweet spot, but it's that time. Like if otherwise I'd be either sitting there forever, which might be good, but, or less time than is really needed. So I think picking a time, it could be artificial. It could be just to give you a point to reassess, reevaluate, and replan. So in weight loss, like what I'm deciding to go through, if I'm saying, okay, I'm going to lose 10 pounds in 6 months, that gives me that goal. But I could say I'm going to evaluate in 3, or I could say, 5 pounds in 3 months and 5 pounds in the next, it just gives you a deadline. And I think it does keep you honest, because otherwise you'll blow the timeline because there's no timeline.
Right. And that's what I see people really stuck in the indecision process, because if you have a boss saying it has to be turned in 2 weeks, or you have a general saying it has to be done by this time, you're following someone else's rules rather than, I loved what you said, being honest with yourself, keeping yourself honest and following your own rules.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people get overeager, like in the workplace. If you're given a deadline and it's not a viable deadline, I think having that discussion, saying, here's why I can't get it done on time and all that makes sense. But in the real world, I think sometimes people are overzealous in what they think they can achieve in a certain amount of time.
Oh, Doug, you're talking to me. Oh, and I am that person. I'm really good at accomplishing my goals, but I'm just like, oh, well, yeah, that'll be done in 6 weeks or something. And people are like, what?
Right.
That's
right.
me for sure.
Right. But I think that's I think that's could sometimes be as much of a failing as not having one, right? Like having too much.
Oh, sure.
I think it is kind of that reassessment. And I think when people hear about it, they feel that their life will become as they view, let's say, the military, or people who are like super planners that like they look and they're like, oh God, I can't imagine doing that. But if you can just do a little of it, right? There's also having reasonable expectations, where overnight you're not going to be like this super planning wonder. I think it's a matter of saying, okay, I'm going to start with one thing, and like everything else could be, but what's the most important thing going on in my life right now? I'm going to plan that way. What lessons did I learn? What paradigms now do I have to face other things? And I think, people, being in lending, I deal with people a lot who have credit issues and things like that, and they just don't know where to start. And like, start small, like pick something that you can work on and have success. And then that success will move to other success, but don't try and do everything at once. And I think that can be another failing that people have.
Well, it's also a way to procrastinate and self-sabotage, because if you have so many things going, then you start to make excuses like, well, the reason I didn't meet that goal is because I had this and this and this going, versus really keeping the main thing the main thing.
Well, and it's trade-offs too, right? It's some people are a little more hedonistic in their time, right? They want everything to be leisure time and all that. But sometimes you have to stop and say, I'll have more leisure time later on if I do this other stuff and really approach certain things that I need to do with a deliberate planning and execution process.
I love it. Doug Katz, tell people where they can find out more about you and your work.
Well, there's a couple of different, I'll throw a bunch. I work currently at a company called On Time Mortgage out of Chicago, where the suburb of Chicago. They can always go to ontimemtg.com to find me there. If you're looking for real estate investment lending, my company is called Red Leg Funding. Red Leg is actually what they used to call artillerymen a long time ago because they had red pants. So I threw it out there because a lot of military guys go, I'm going to go with you. I like the military thing. And then I have another company called Split Ready. That's where I do a lot of my mediation out of. So got kind of the basis covered. SplitReady.com is Split Ready. RedLegFunding.com is my investment real estate business. And I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't plug my podcast. With my partner on Split Ready, we have a podcast called Getting Started.life. It's a little bit about the stuff we're talking about now, is starting new things, but getting kind of those first steps on how to be successful. And I think what we're talking about now is a lot about that, right? The reason people fail is not always because they don't like an activity. It's because they haven't really approached it the right way. And we cover everything on that show from, again, we did disaster preparedness yesterday. We did ballroom dancing a couple of weeks ago. So we kind of cover the gamut of stuff, but that's at gettingstarted.life. There's all these, everyone thinks .com, but there's a lot of other things these days. So that's my podcast, and they can find some great stuff there.
Awesome, Doug. I have loved both of our conversations now that we've had two, but for this one recorded for our audience on planning, executing, and becoming your own best problem solver. So thanks for coming on.
But I would say, right, don't become such a good problem solver that you don't need a coach, because we all need coaches.
Yeah. We all do. Yes. Well, what's funny is I've hired a nutrition coach, and I've lost 10 pounds in the last 2 months.
It's interesting. And on an ending note, I was talking to my son. My youngest plays basketball, and he's had a couple good games, couple not so good. And we were talking about it, and I'm like, I said, hey, do you want to get we'll get you private coaching for shooting or something, or private coaching for, and he's like, I don't need that. I'm doing practice. I'm like, yes, but if you look at pros, they've got coaches to help them with everything. Having a coach is not a failure. Having a coach is recognition that that's a resource that you need to either help you find that objective, help you figure out the right timeline, help you do all those things. So I think it's so important that people recognize that and don't try and do everything themselves, because that's another recipe for failure.
I think things taking 2 or 3 or 5 times as long as they should have taken is failing. Yeah. Hiring a coach. He was my first nutrition coach. I've never even been on a diet, but I wrote my second book. Guys, writing a book is terrible for your health. It really is. You just sit and sit and sit, and it's just really easy to gain weight during that process. So every time I write a book, I kind of had the COVID and the book thing now. So, I'm swinging back in the right direction.
So the little pedal things where you can kind of sit at your desk and pedal while you're working.
I do. Yeah. So could I have done it on my own? Of course I could have. Right. I know I should eat more vegetables and eat more, or eat less, eat more vegetables and move more. I know that, but I got results very quickly, and I know you get results for your clients quickly. I get results for my clients quickly, and life is hard enough. Why not make it easier on yourself, right?
Well, it never ceases to amaze me, the people who are in a professional role and say, they should come to me because I'm a professional. But then when they have certain needs that are outside the scope of what they understand, they're like, oh, I'll do it myself. And I'm like, have you done that before? No. Well, how, why do that? You're going to spend 3 times as much and get right.
And with the consequences of not having executed, right? Not having that clear objective, not the accountability, not whatever it is, right? Another great conversation, Doug.
Right.
Thank you so much for helping us.
Thank you for having me on, really.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you got to come and help us become a little more toxic person proof.